Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic Grammar Lessons. This is Lesson 15, in which we'll be talking about participles. And more information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 120 to 129. Let's take a look at a notional paradigm chart for strong verbs. I say notional because not all these forms are attested for strong verbs, and we have to do a little bit of artificial reconstruction to get what would be the strong verb paradigm. But it's useful then for branching off from this to know what the forms for weak verbs would be. Now, the first thing we notice as we look at this chart might be that the internal passive stems, that is to say the dedicated passive voice stems, have no participles. The main active voice stems supply the passive participle forms. That is to say, there's a pa'al and a pa'al passive. For instance, much like in Biblical Hebrew, there's a kal active participle and a kal passive participle. So this is nothing unusual in Biblical Aramaic because we then look over to the left and see the D, pa'el stem, supplying a DP, pa'el passive participle. But just as was the case for G, I'm placing the P in parentheses because it's really a subset of the pa'el active voice participle with only a slight difference of vowels. And we'll see that as we go through the individual stems briefly. And then on the bottom, the C stem, hafel, supplies the hafel passive. And we also have an afel and a shafel. And we'll take a look at those for the various C stem variants. But first, let's just look at the pa'al, the most basic form of the Biblical Aramaic participle. It's active voice, and it has this vowel pattern. You see I place that comets in red for all of them, and then for the masculine singular form we have that tsere. And you can see these vowels reflected in the ayin beit dalet verbal root. This is the do or make verbal root. There just isn't a feminine plural participle of that root attested. But you can see that root reflecting these forms. Now we move over to pa'al passive. Now interestingly, it looks like in the masculine singular form that this is the same vowel pattern as pa'il, the internal passive form. And that is correct. That the masculine singular pa'al passive participle is indeed identical to the pa'il perfect third person masculine singular that we'll see in the next lesson. However, obviously in the feminine singular, masculine plural, feminine plural forms, we're adding participle endings onto that basic pa'al passive form. So it is indeed a participle and not a pa'il finite verb, a perfect finite verb. Okay, and we see in the same verbal root the pa'al participle masculine singular and the pa'al passive participle masculine singular form attested for beit, resh, kaf. And you can see those vowel patterns and so forth in that verbal root. Moving on to hit pa'el. This is the reflexive stem, if you remember, for the G stem. So it's TG, okay? And we see a mit prefix where the tav prefix gives us in the abbreviation for comparative Semitic studies, that little t in the TG abbreviation. Now, what's special about the hit pa'el? Well, it's related to hit pa'al, the TD form, but it does not have a doubled middle root consonant for that verbal root. Okay, both of these stems in the participle, TG and TD, both have a mit prefix, but an easy distinguishing factor. I mean, of course, it looks like that there is a different set of vowels for the masculine singular, but the very reliable means of distinguishing between TG and TD participles would be noticing is there or is there not that doubled middle consonants that's characteristic of the D stems. All right? And now we move on to pa'el. Okay, so the D, DP, and TD stems all have that doubled middle consonant that we expect with the paradigm setting pa'el, right? Okay, and then we're going to notice the difference between pa'el participles and the pa'el passive. And that is in the masculine singular forms, There's just that different vowel pattern. And that's a fairly slight difference, especially when most verbal roots that have participles in Biblical Aramaic are weak verbs anyway, so there's a vowel change expected. Okay, pa'el passive also, of course, has the doubled middle consonant, and interestingly, there are actually more pa'el passive attested forms, there's even a feminine plural there, than the pa'el, so to speak, the active voice D participle. And we see the different vocalizations here in the pa'el participle masculine singular of the hey lamed kaf verbal root versus the beit resh kaf, and it's just due to the dynamics there in the beit resh kaf form where you cannot double that middle consonant that we have compensatory lengthening on what would have been the patach under the beit, making it a comet. So we do indeed see the vowel patterns shown in the table in these two verbal roots compared. And then finally we have hit pa'al, which, as we said, has the doubled middle root consonant, distinguishing it from the TG hit pa'el. Okay, and then moving down to the C stem variants, hafel, what prefix does it have? Well, it has the mem prefix that we already saw with the pa'el and pa'el passive, right? But it has the hey prefix of hafel, all right? And the hafel passive, what's the difference here? Well, in masculine singular, we have a vowel difference, just like there was a masculine singular vowel difference between pa'el and pa'el passive. But otherwise, as we can see with masculine plural, it's the same expected form. What is different here with the C stems is, of course, we have an afel and a shafel. And interestingly, the afel has more different permutations of gender and number than even hafel does. And I'm going to place on the left and the right of these tables the same verbal root, a participle, feminine singular, attested for chet, tzadi, pei, that verbal root. Okay? And on the right, the hafel, and on the left, the afel. And you can see the vowel difference for the mem prefix. And you can see how for the afel participle, the aleph has dropped out. The aleph, which would be the causative prefix for the afel stem, has dropped out for the afel forms. It's still there for the hafel forms. And you can see that on the right with that first, well, with the hey there after the mem. So you have the mem prefix and the distinctive causative prefix consonant, and in the case of the aleph, it drops. And then finally we get over to shafel. All right, so for shafel, there's only one attested participle, and you can see that we've had to do a little adjustment there of the verbal root to come up with a notional strong verb paradigm, but it is similar where we have the mem prefix with a shava, just as we do over there in the hafel, if you see, and we have the distinctive causative prefix consonant sheen for shafel, we have that, and then we have the verbal root following. Now, what are the uses of participles? Let's remember participles are verbal adjectives, so they have adjective uses. So here's attributive. Its wheels were burning fire. So the first word is its wheels, next, fire, last in red, burning. Okay, so what kind of fire was it? It was a burning fire there in Daniel 7:9. So this is a pretty easy to see example of a pa'al participle masculine singular that's acting as an attributive participle. It's a very adjectival use. Okay, next, predicative. So just like other kinds of adjectives, participles can be predicative, where the we can see here in these predicative uses the greater role that participles play in the biblical Aramaic verbal system as compared to the biblical Hebrew one. All right, so here's the pa'al participle masculine plural building, and you can see I've just taken a snippet here of Ezra 4:12, but you can see the predicative use building. It's applying the verb-like idea, building the rebellious and wicked city. So that's the city, the rebellious, and the wicked building in the word order there. And then finally, there's a substantive use of participles. and all the inhabitants of the earth. And interestingly, this is what Biblical Hebrew also does with its inhabitants verbal root. Okay, the yod, shin, beit verbal root. And here we have the Aramaic counterpart in Daniel 4:32. Okay, so lastly, I'd like to discuss the use of reflexive stems to express passive voice. So in the upper right, I have the pa'alg, participle masculine plural, in Ezra 5:11. We are building the house. And also in the same verse, the pa'algp, participle masculine singular, that was built many years before now. And we see the passive voice reflected in the English to be verb, helper verb, placed before the built idea. Now, here's the hitpa'el, tg, participle masculine singular. Same verbal root, and really the same literary context, just a few verses before in Ezra 5:8. It is being built with large stones. Now, it's definitely a hitpa'el, tg, because we see the mit prefix, and the nun, the middle consonant of the verbal root, is not doubled, which would make it a tg, right? So this is definitely the hitpa'el, tg, participle masculine singular, the reflexive voice stem for G. However, reflexive voice doesn't make sense here. Passive voice does. And this is a trend we'll see with finite verbs as well, that the TG will often express a GP kind of idea. The TD will often express a DP idea, and so forth. Okay, so only TG and TD participles, not TC, are attested in Biblical Aramaic. Well, that concludes our study of participles. We want to remember that participles play a greater role in the Biblical Aramaic verbal system than participles do in the Biblical Hebrew verbal system. Participles, in their predicative use, can substitute for finite verbs, especially in that present tense kind of use. And the attributive use and the substantive use also mirror uses of adjectives because participles are verbal adjectives. And we just want to remember also that participles can partner with the hey vav hey verb to create a compound verb tense of imperfective viewpoint aspect. Next up in Lesson 16, perfect verbs. I look forward to seeing you then.